Good morning. I'm Penny Pennington. I'm an alcoholic. I'm really grateful to be here, and I know that Jim wasn't feeling well and that he and Vinoy had to leave, but I'm really grateful that Vinoy called and asked me to come down here this weekend and participate in your conference. This is just a beautiful setting, and it's just been really wonderful for us so far. I feel really privileged to be here. I don't know if anyone can identify with this, but when I walked in the doors of Alcoholics Anonymous, I was fairly self-righteous and arrogant, and I thought I had a right to my seat in these rooms. And what I've come to understand in the time that I've been sober in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous is that it's a privilege to be allowed to participate in a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, and that it's a privilege that I have to repay through love and service. And sometimes my service gets to be standing here and sharing my story with you, talking about my favorite topic. And sometimes service means that I'm stacking chairs and that I'm cleaning tables and that I'm throwing away styrofoam coffee cups. And in my home group, it means that I stack chairs and throw away styrofoam coffee cups. I want to thank Vinoy and Jim for inviting us down here this weekend, and I want to thank Jerry for, after Carol spoke and cried through her talk, Jerry asked if I cry when I speak, and I said yes, and he said, I'll get you a box of Kleenex right here. And I don't know if George is still here, but when I got in yesterday, I got the wrong room number, and actually they had put me in with Bill. And I didn't think, with Carol's admonition and my husband here, I didn't think it was probably a good idea. So I had to go find where I was actually supposed to be. And George was nice enough to, on demand, carry my bag to my room after he'd been playing basketball. And so he was very worn out and had a little resentment at me yesterday afternoon. So I want to thank him. It has been my experience in the time that I've been sober in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous that if I ever get up in front of a room of recovering alcoholics to tell you the truth about myself and tell you that I'm not nervous, that I'm going to lie about other things too. So I'm just going to put that out there, that I always get nervous when I speak. I hope it's just God shaking the truth out of me. I grew up in the Midwest, and I probably had a good childhood. I'm not really sure if I did or not. I didn't drink in high school. It probably could have helped, but I didn't know that it would have helped, so I didn't try it. I hung around with a lot of different people in high school. I hung around with the folks on the literary magazine, and I always wanted to be a writer. And I thought that, that this was the way to do it. I'd get involved. I was on the school paper. I was on the yearbook. I was on the literary magazine. If it's worth doing, it's worth doing to excess. So I hung around with the kids on the literary magazine that smoked dope and did drugs. And I hung around I was also involved in sports. I tried being a cheerleader, but I don't really enjoy doing the tumbling and all of that other stuff that goes along with cheerleading, so they didn't take me for a cheerleader. So what I did was I got a resentment, and I got involved in sports and made them cheer for me. So I hung out with the jocks, and so as a result of that, I went to keggers and hung out with kids who drank beer. I dated this guy in high school that was one of the bad boys, so I hung out with the kids who got people to buy bottles for him. And through all of this, I didn't drink and I didn't use. I'm not quite sure why I didn't. I just didn't. And I graduated from high school. I was 18 years old. I got engaged at my senior prom. And in the next year, I broke that engagement 5 times. And the last time that David gave me the ring back, he said, if you give me this ring back one more time, I'm going to walk out of your life and you're never going to see me again. And I was 18 years old. I was a freshman in college. And I thought that if I don't marry this man, I will be an old maid. So I told him to set the date, and we got married about a month later and went to New York on our honeymoon. I grew up in the Midwest. We went to Niagara Falls. That's where you go when you grow up in the Midwest. And I got drunk on our honeymoon. Drinking age was 18, and and I had my first drink, and I remember how it made me feel. I remember where now I'd grown up around alcohol. I have every one of my mother's brothers and sisters is an alcoholic. One of my mother's brothers died of a wet brain. My grandfather died as a direct result of being intoxicated. At a family reunion a few years ago, my sister-in-law was taking some videotapes, and she asked each of us to give a family memory on our videotape. And I talked about the gatherings at Grandma's house and how I remember holidays at Grandma's house. And I remember my grandma and these wonderful parties and the wonderful Polish food that we had at Grandma's house for holidays. And my cousin, who is standing right next to me, remembers the drunken brawls at holidays at Grandma's house. And I don't remember those things. But I grew up around booze and found myself 18 years old in Niagara Falls, able to drink legally, and I picked up a drink, and it made me feel like a lady. And it made me feel like I was a part of. And it made me feel like you looked. You know, I'd grown up and I'd gone through school, and I didn't know how you guys knew how to do stuff. I didn't know how you knew how to apply for college and how to do SATs and how to go out on dates, because I didn't know how to do that stuff. I just had this fear inside that I wasn't going to be good enough. And you all just seemed to do it so well. I didn't know that some of you were drunk doing that. Didn't learn that till I got here, as a matter of fact. But so here I was, 18 years old, on my honeymoon, and drunk through the entire thing. Drunk every night and puking most of the rest of the time. And my marriage lasted less than a year. I know that we don't name anyone an alcoholic, but if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck and drinks like a duck, I married a duck. My marriage was on the rocks very quickly, and I thought that there was only that I had my choice of two things to do to save my marriage. One was to have a child, and the other was to drink with my husband. And I chose to drink with my husband. David and I were not well off. We both worked for a newspaper and a small local paper. We stopped every night on the way home from work to pick up a couple of six-packs of beer for him. And I would pick up Ripple wine. I heard that. Those of you who groaned at Ripple wine are not going to like it when I talk about drinking warm beer filtered through cigarette butts. But that's what my morning afters were like. I didn't like Ripple wine, but I could afford Ripple wine. And I don't think we had wine in a box then. Ripple wine was the predecessor to wine in a box. Ripple wine used to come in flavors. They don't make Ripple wine anymore. I stopped drinking. Claire Selden stopped drinking. We both drank Ripple, and they went out of business. But Ripple wine used to come in different flavors, and I don't know what the flavors were, but I know that each flavor had a different color label. And I would buy one bottle of each different color label, and then I would go home, and I had this big tub, and I'd pour all of the Ripple wine into this tub, and I'd mix it up, and then I'd pour it back into the bottles, and I had my own private label, Rainbow Ripple. And it took me where I needed to go, which was any place other than where I was. My marriage ended when my husband threw me through the living room window for the second time. And some of us are sicker than others. I went back to him after the first time. And I left that marriage, and I moved in with my sister, who might be a duck. We're not sure. Jury's still out. She might be a periodic duck. I lived with her for a while, and then I moved in with a roommate out in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And my roommate is probably a duck. My roommate Alice Alice and I, my very first contact with Alcoholics Anonymous was through Alice. Alice and I were drinking together, and one evening We got very remorse about our drinking and were crying in our whatever it was we were drinking that night, and decided to call Alcoholics Anonymous. And Alice called Alcoholics Anonymous and talked to some woman on the phone who said that she would send us some literature. And a few days later, we were sober by now, we got the 20 questions in the mail, and Alice and I sat down at the kitchen table and went through the 20 questions and joked about it. And that was my whole contact with Alcoholics Anonymous at that time. I met my second husband and met him through, I was dating this guy and I didn't want to be with him, and this friend of his came out to dinner with us one evening, so I flirted with this friend of my boyfriend's so that my boyfriend would get mad at me and leave me. And this other guy asked me out, and so I went out with him, and I wound up marrying him, and he didn't drink. I got drunk on our very first date. I was still an underage drinker in Michigan at this time. Drinking age was 21, and I was still an underage drinker. And we went to bars, and I ordered drinks, and they served me, and I ordered a different drink in every bar. And the last bar that we went to, I got drunk, fell out of the booth, and he had to carry me out. That evening later when I came to, he said, you know, you might have a drinking problem. You just don't know how to party. I got involved in drugs in college and went to parties. I was talking last night with some folks at dinner about going to parties in college where you had to bring your own bottle. And I always brought an empty bottle in a brown paper bag and put it in the very back. And then when I'd leave, I'd go into the kitchen and I'd take all of the dregs out of all of the other bottles and I'd pour them into my empty bottle and take it home so that I'd have something to drink. And it took me where I needed to go. You know, and that's the kind of drinker I was. I married my second husband, and the marriage was on the rocks before we said our vows. I never meant the vows. I was going outside of the relationship before we said our vows. And in order to save our marriage, my husband suggested that we move to Hawaii, and we moved to Hawaii, and I became a bar drinker. My marriage fell apart, and I was drinking in Skid Row bars, and I was supporting my habit the way women who drink in Skid Row bars support their habit. If you were a woman bar drinker, you know how that made me feel. If you were a man bar drinker that ever bought a drink for a woman in a bar, I want to take this opportunity to thank you, because you maybe didn't buy me a drink. But I pray to God that if you bought a drink for a woman in a bar, that it was the drink that got her to the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, because I know that it took every drink I took and everything I did to get me to walk in these doors. I remember that my husband had a terrible problem with my drinking, and so what I did, and he talked to me about it, or screamed at me about it, one or the other. And so what I did was I decided that I was going to prove that I wasn't an alcoholic, so I was going to quit drinking. Before I was going to quit drinking, I thought that maybe I'd try controlling my drinking. So what I did was I only drank when he was out of town. And he was in food sales, and so he went out of town to the neighbor islands fairly frequently. And when he'd go out of town, I'd get drunk. When I knew that he was coming back, I'd make sure that the house was clean and the dogs were clean and everything was taken care of and that I was clean. And he'd walk in the house and he'd take one look at me and he'd say, "You've been drinking again, haven't you?" And I didn't know how he knew. I didn't know that when you drink, you sweat booze. And I didn't know that he could smell it on me. So I decided, we had an argument one night, and I chugged a bottle of wine. He was very upset that I chugged that bottle of wine. This was not a bottle of Ripple. This was apparently a good bottle of wine. It had a cork and everything. We got in this argument. The bottle was there. It was open. I chugged it. He was upset because I hadn't allowed it to breathe. Well, you know, folks, Ripple never needed to breathe, you know. And So we had this terrible row about this bottle that I'd chugged, and I said, okay, I'll quit. I'll just quit drinking. And I didn't know about withdrawal, and I didn't know about detoxification, and I thought I had the flu. And I was sick for the next week, and when I finally came through it, all of a sudden I was faced with reality without a buffer, and I couldn't deal with it. And I thought that what I was having was a nervous breakdown. I didn't know that what I needed was Alcoholics Anonymous. So I went to a shrink, and he asked me why I was there, and I said, well, I don't like myself. And he said, what is it about you that you don't like? And I said, well, I don't like the way I look, and I don't like the way I think, and I don't like the things I say, and I don't like the things I do, and I really just do not like myself. He said, well, let's start with the way you look. Here's some diet pills. So I left his office that afternoon, and I went to Long's Drugs at Ala Moana Shopping Center. And I went in and I asked to talk to the pharmacist. And I explained to the pharmacist that there was a family emergency on the mainland, and it's incredibly difficult to get prescriptions filled on the mainland. And would it be at all possible for me to have all of my refills to take with me on my emergency trip? And he said, sure. And I walked out of Long's Drugs that afternoon with a little white bag full of little brown bottles, full of little white pills. And I still wasn't supporting my habit. Now the insurance company was paying for it. And I went home and I took those pills whenever I thought I was having a sudden outbreak of fat. And I went back to the doctor a week later and I said, these pills don't seem to be working very well for me. Do you think you could give me something else? The house was clean and the pool was clean and the dogs were clean and everything was fine and I was just fine, but these pills don't seem to be working and maybe there could be something else that could help me very much. And so he gave me another prescription and I went to a different pharmacy and I talked to a different pharmacist and I explained that there was a family emergency on the mainland and it was really hard to get refills and could I? Oh, sure. And I walked out with a white bag full of little brown bottles full of little orange pills. And most of the summer of 1977 is a blackout for me. I know that I drank while I was doing speed. I'm not sure that my body has ever quite figured out what was going on there with the speed and the depressant, but it got me through the summer of 1977. And I tried all of those things that it talks about in Chapter 3. I tried never having it at home. I tried drinking only at home. I used to say that I tried drinking only natural wines until my sponsor pointed out that Ripple's never seen a grape. I tried taking more physical exercise. One of the things that I did was I joined a softball team, and we made it to the league championships, the city championships, and I was a shortstop on the team, and I probably had a hangover or something. Anyway, we were in this playoff game. I missed a real easy field. My coach very unceremoniously pulled me out of the game and replaced me. I questioned whether his mother knew who his father was and got in my car and stormed off and thought, I'll show those guys. I will run my car off of Diamond Head Road, and that'll do it. I had this nice little sports car at that time that my husband had gotten me, and he was out of town at the time, so I was feeling very sorry for myself. I'll show him. I'll be found at the bottom of the cliff off of Diamond Head, and he will feel so bad because I was driving this sports car, and obviously I must have just lost control. And my coach would feel so bad because he had treated me so shabbily, and all of these people would just feel so bad. And then I realized as I got onto Diamond Head Road that I was concerned that I wouldn't hit the wall hard enough, that at the last minute I'd pick my foot up off the accelerator, and that I wouldn't hit the wall hard enough to go over and to die, that maybe what I'd do is just hurt myself. And I didn't want to hurt myself. I wanted to kill myself. So I decided that maybe what I needed was to have a drink, and that then I could commit suicide. So I went home to fix myself a drink, and I walked into the house, and I think that what I fixed was, by this time I was keeping my vodka in the freezer, and I took a can of frozen orange juice and put it into a blender, and then filled up the rest of the blender with vodka. And I think that was the last drink that I fixed. The miracle of that for me is that before I poured myself a drink, I went to the back of the house and picked up the phone and called Alcoholics Anonymous. And I'd love to tell you that I had a moment of clarity, that what happened for me was I called AA and I knew that that's what I needed. I called Alcoholics Anonymous and a woman answered the phone. I was a bar drinker. I didn't like women. I knew what you would do to get the man that was buying my booze to buy your booze. And I knew what I would do to get the man that was buying your booze to buy mine. And I didn't like you and I didn't trust you. And I need to say, because I don't always remember to say it later in my story, that women are my best friends today. I love the men in Alcoholics Anonymous, but it's the women who have saved my ass. And my greatest friends in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, other than my dear husband, are the women. And I can never thank you for what you've done for me. This woman answered the phone, and I told her that I'd like to know something about this Alcoholics Anonymous thing for a friend of mine that I think might have a problem. And she said, maybe you'd like to go to a meeting. And I said, I don't think my friend would want to do that. Maybe you could send me some literature. And she said, well, you know, we don't send out literature. We recommend that you go to a meeting to get literature. Because then you could meet some people and you could get the literature and you could tell your friend about Alcoholics Anonymous. I said, I don't think that would work. Maybe you could just tell me about Alcoholics Anonymous. I thought I could get it by osmosis. So she started to talk about Alcoholics Anonymous, and as many of you know, it's hard to talk about AA without talking about a higher power. She used the word God. I interrupted her and explained to her that I didn't believe in God. She asked me if my friend believed in God. I let her tell me where there was a meeting. I'm having problems with my contact up here. That's okay, I don't need to see. I went to my first meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous at the YMCA on Atkinson Road across from Ala Moana Shopping Center. And I remember pulling up to this place, and there were a bunch of people standing around outside drinking coffee and smoking cigarettes and laughing and talking. And I wondered who they were, because they were having such a good time. They obviously weren't alcoholics. And I parked my car and I walked into this room, and it was huge. It was just this huge room. And maybe about twice the size of the registration room here. Huge room. And the woman on the phone had said, go up to the first person you see and tell them you're a newcomer. And then she said, go up to the first woman you see and tell her you're a newcomer. So I walked into this room. There was no one in the room. Everyone was standing outside. And then as I looked around, I saw the coffee pots in the back, and there was one person by the coffee pots, a woman named Blanche W. And I walked back, and before I could say anything, I started crying. And Blanche looked at me and she said, oh, you're a newcomer. Hi, I'm Blanche. She took me outside and she introduced me to some of the women of Alcoholics Anonymous. And women gave me their phone numbers. A couple of the men gave me their phone numbers, and the women took them away from me. We went inside to the meeting, and the secretary of the meeting was a fellow named Alan Kay. And Alan asked if there were any newcomers at the meeting. He said, this isn't to embarrass you, just so we can get to know you after the meeting. Do we have any newcomers? And I was sitting next to a woman named Connie C., and Connie kind of nudged me, and my hand went up. And Alan said, would you like to give us your name? And I cried through my whole first meeting. Actually, I cried through my whole first 18 years. I remember at that meeting that they asked for newcomers and then they asked for 30 days. And Connie C. was sitting next to me, and Connie stood up and said that she had 30 days. And then they asked for 60 days and 90 days, and then they asked for years. And the woman sitting on the other side of me, Renee, stood up and said that her name was Renee, and she was an alcoholic, and she had a year of sobriety. And I remember looking at Renee and thinking, God, when I get a year of sobriety, I'm going to have it together like Renee. And I remember a year later when I had a year of sobriety and Renee had 2 years of sobriety, and I sat there and I heard Renee stand up and say that she had 2 years, and I thought, boy, when I have 2 years of sobriety, I'm going to have it together like Renee does. And when I had 2 years of sobriety, Renee had gone out and drank. I do understand that Renee has made it back to the program of... No, that's not true. I understand that Renee is no longer drinking. We are not sure if Renee is going to meetings. I sat in this meeting and I listened to these people talk, and I thought, that's real nice for those of you who really need it, but you see, I'm different. And I left the meeting that night and I went home, and I didn't drink and I didn't use, and I didn't go to meetings, and for a week. I came back a week later. I thought I had joined Sunday Night AA. I thought it was maybe like Weight Watchers, you go once a week and they'll give you a card and you'll get it checked or something so that they know you've been there. When I walked into the meeting the following Sunday night, Blanche was there. She's a coffee maker. She's got a commitment. And she came up to me and she said, Penny, how you doing? And I said, doing good. She said, how many meetings did you make this week? And I said, well, I was here last Sunday night. And she said, during the week, how many meetings did you go to during the week? I was here last Sunday night. She said, no. She picked up a meeting schedule and she marked a couple meetings on it. And then she took me outside and she took me over to Connie and she said, I've marked the meetings that I'm going to meet Penny at this week. Would you mark the meetings you'll meet Penny at? And Connie marked a couple meetings, and then she walked me over to Renee. And she said, I've marked the meetings I'm going to meet Penny at this week. Would you mark them? And Blanche has marked her meetings. Would you mark the meetings that you're going to meet Penny at? And I went to AA meetings because I thought it would be rude not to show up. And I've found that there's no wrong reason to come here. I sat in meetings and I was so afraid. I was afraid that if the women of Alcoholics Anonymous knew how I had supported my habit, that you were going to ask me to leave. If you'd known the things that I did in my drinking and the places that my drinking had taken me. If you'd known that I drank in Skid Row bars and supported my habit the way women who drink in Skid Row bars support their habit, and that I slept in my car, that you'd ask me to leave. And I was so afraid that I was different that I couldn't let you get to know me. I had the opportunity to speak at a speakers meeting in our area just about a year or so ago, and just as I stepped up to the podium to speak, a woman walked in the back door of the room. And it was like watching myself walk into a room of Alcoholics Anonymous. You know, she had that look that newcomer women have. I don't know if newcomer men have it, but I know newcomer women have it, where you can see the pain all over us. And we're standing there saying, don't get too close. You know, the look that Ray talked about last night when he spoke, that look that we get. You're not going to like me. Don't you step a foot closer. And I remember doing that, and I remember being that way. I sat in these rooms and I listened to you talk about the steps, and I was afraid the steps weren't going to work for me. I listened to you talk about how you worked them, and I thought, that's not going to happen for me. You know, I had stood on the steps of a church in 1970 drunk on a Sunday morning while Mass was letting out, and I had screamed obscenities at my higher power for what he had done to me in my life. And that was the last time I'd had God in my life. And this was 7.5 years later, and I was sitting in meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous, and you were talking about God. and I knew it wasn't going to work for me. I knew that God couldn't love me because God knew what I had done. You know, I'd been taught in catechism that God knows all. And I was so ashamed. And I sat in these rooms for 18 months without working the steps. What I did do was I listened to the things that people said that other people nodded their head at, and I'd take it to another meeting and I'd pass it off as if it was mine. And people came up to me after meetings and they said, God, you're doing great. And I thought, if I'm doing so good, why does my gut hurt so bad? And for 18 months I sat here and I had taken the booze and the drugs out of my system and I hadn't replaced it with anything. And I talked the talk but wasn't walking the walk and hadn't done the work. And at the end of 18 months, the solution that I had was the same solution I'd had on October 9th, 1977 when I walked into my first meeting. The only solution I could come up with was suicide. And I decided how I was going to kill myself, and I was going to do it on a Saturday, and I would do it in such a way that it would make the front page of the Sunday paper. And I went to a meeting on Friday night so that when you heard on Sunday morning that I was dead, and you would feel so bad. And this was like, the ultimate finger of fate at you folks. I'll show you, sons of bitches. And as I walked out of that meeting that night, a fella grabbed me by the arm and kind of pushed me up against a car, and he said, Penny, if you keep doing what you're doing, you're going to die. He didn't tell me I was going to get drunk, and he didn't tell me I was going to get loaded. He told me I was going to die. And I looked at him and I said, I don't know what you're talking about. And I got in my car and I drove off, and I didn't kill myself the next day just to prove that he was wrong. And shortly after that, God put a woman in my life from Southern California. And through a series of circumstances, she wound up staying in my home. And I thought that Kay was a whole new audience for my terrible tale of woe. I had come into the program, and I had lost, after I got sober, I lost my home. I came home one day and found a note from my husband that he had gone out of town on business. He'd be back in a week, and we needed to talk. That was 18 years ago. He's not home yet. As a result of him leaving, he emptied out our savings account and overdrew our checking account. I was evicted from our home. My car was repossessed. And I was sued for $500,000. And this was after coming into the program. And I thought that Kay was a whole new audience for this stuff and all of the stuff that had led up to it. And so I started telling her my story. And every time I'd pause to take a breath, Kay would look at me and she'd say, Penny, that's very interesting. Problem is, you're an alcoholic and you haven't worked the steps. Clearly, she wasn't hearing exactly what my problem was. So I explained to her in words that she might understand that I had, this was what had happened to me and I'd been evicted and blah, 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 blah. And I'd pause to take a breath, and Kay would look at me and she said, Penny, that's fascinating. Problem is, you're an alcoholic and you haven't worked the steps. And no matter what I said, Kay's response was the same. Interesting information, Penny. Problem is, you're an alcoholic and you haven't worked the steps. So I worked the steps to prove that they wouldn't work for me. And what I've come to understand in the time that I've been sober in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous is that the steps don't know who's working them, the steps just work. And as I've stayed sober in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous and worked the steps on several different things in my life, I've come to find out that the steps don't know why I'm working them, the steps just work. And as I've worked the steps over and over in my life, I've come to understand that the steps don't know how many times I've worked them. The steps just work. I went through the steps. I had made an attempt to go through the steps earlier in my sobriety, but I was doing it without a sponsor. And so I went through the steps, and I didn't really think I needed 1, 2, or 3 because I didn't believe in God. This is my big book. It's not my talk. I I tried doing step 4, and I heard people say that you have to do step 4 the way it is in the big book, so I looked at those 3 columns on page 65, and I had my own Mr. Brown, Mrs. Jones, and my employer. I was unemployed. I didn't really have an employer. I had a former employer. And then what the cause was and what it affected. And the problem was that I never turned the page to see that sentence that says to conclude that others were wrong was as far as most of us ever got. As far as I got was what it affected. And so I found out where everybody was wrong. And then I did a 5th step. Now, I was on a trip when I did my 5th step. I'd been to a meeting, and I knew that I had this 5th step that I needed to do, and I really thought that it was best to do this 5th step with someone out of town who wouldn't know me. And so I'd gone to this meeting, and I picked out this man who I thought looked like he'd be good to hear my 5th step. And I asked him if he'd listened to my 5th step, and he did. Now, I don't know if he'd ever heard a 5th step before. I don't think he'd ever done a 5th step. I'm not sure he was sober when he heard my 5th step. He thought I did a great 5th step. He suggested that I go right on to 6 and 7, 8 and 9, and I thought that was interesting advice for those of you who really need it, but I'd done a 4th and a 5th, and that's fine now. And so when Kay said to me that I needed to work the steps, I really wanted to tell her that I had, except then she started talking to me about how the steps work, and I thought for some reason that perhaps I should not explain to her that I had this other theory about how the steps worked. So I listened to what Kay said, and my sponsor at that time was dying, and I didn't want to impose, and I didn't want to get another sponsor because it would hurt her feelings. So I tried doing the steps my way, and I tried doing them. I tried using the 12 and 12. I tried listening to what people were saying in meetings. I knew I was going to have to get a new sponsor because of Peg dying, and I really didn't want to be 18 months sober and ask someone to be my sponsor and have to fess up to the fact that I hadn't worked the steps. So when Peg passed away and I got Susan for a sponsor, I told her that I'd done the steps, and she asked about my 4th step. She didn't ask about 1, 2, and 3. She started asking. She said, "Oh, you've done all of the steps. You've done all of the steps." I said, "Yeah." She said, "Well, let me just ask you a few questions about the steps." The first question she asked was the promises. Now, what promises did you find in the steps? And I said, "Oh, the promises are on page 83 and 84. She said, "No, the promises that come before that." I said, "No, the promises, page 83 and 84, aren't they? Right after step 9 and 10. She said, "No, there's promises earlier than that." She says, "Okay." She says, I understand that. Not everybody knows about those. She says, "What about the prayers in step 4? How many of the prayers did you use in step 4? I said, "Oh, no. There's a prayer in step 3, and there's a prayer in step 7, and then if you use the 12 and 12, there's an 11-step prayer." She said, "Let's go to your big book." And Susan started me out with chapter 3 for step 1. And we read through chapter 3, and she pointed out where it says that we had to concede to our innermost selves that we were alcoholic. This is the first step in recovery. What a concept. And she took me through chapter 3 for the first step, and then chapter 4 for the second step. And I got to talk with her about the higher power that I had come to believe in that I didn't think loved me or cared for me. And through the women of Alcoholics Anonymous, that my sponsor made me go to women's meetings and made me drive to meetings with women and pick women up and take them to meetings. I had a car by this time, and she told me that God had given me that car, and so I needed to use it for sobriety. And I had to pick up people and take them to meetings. I had to call the service center, and in Hawaii, as some of you may be aware, we get lots of visitors in Hawaii and that want to go to meetings, and they're staying down in Waikiki. My sponsor made me call the service center and put my name on a list of people who would actually drive into Waikiki and pick tourists up. This is not something that anyone who lives in Honolulu likes to do, this driving into Waikiki bit. But I had to call and put my name on the list, and I had to call, and if people called and said they wanted to get to a meeting, I had to go into Waikiki and pick them up. And I had to pick them up early enough to get to the meeting at least 15 minutes early. so that I had time to spend with people who were on vacation and had the knowledge to call Alcoholics Anonymous. That they knew the priorities of Alcoholics Anonymous, that they had to, while on vacation, did not go away from AA. And so I got to spend time with people from all over the world. And I got to share with women. And I got to learn about a higher power. And then we went on to the third step and then the fourth step. And when I started my fourth step, I said, well, I've done those 3 columns that are on page 65. And she said, yes, and now you turn the page. And so I turned the page and I saw that sentence. And I realized that there was going to be a whole lot more work here and it might be a little bit painful. But by this time, I had a support system that I had never had before. And as I wrote my fourth step, my sponsor talked to me about the 5 prayers that are in step 4. That there's 2 places specifically that say we pray for the sick man and we pray for a right ideal. But that there's 3 other places that say that we ask God. And that what asking God is prayer. And just this past week, I had the opportunity to share with a woman I sponsor about the 4th step. And we were talking about those prayers. I have talked too long. My life has been absolutely incredible since I've been introduced to the steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. And my life has changed incredibly. When I had 2.5 years of sobriety, I left Hawaii and moved to the East Coast. And went to meetings in Virginia for a year saying, hi, my name's Penny Pennington. I'm an alcoholic and you're not doing it right. They do it a lot differently there than we do it in either Hawaii or California. They don't do all the reading that we do. It was very strange for me. It was very difficult for me to adjust to. I didn't know I was doing that. After a year, somebody said to me, you know, Penny, we do it fine. And I didn't know what they meant. When in 1986, I had the opportunity to come out here to California on a business trip. And while I was out here, I went to meetings. My sponsors have always taught me that I need to go to meetings when I'm out of town, that I don't go away from Alcoholics Anonymous. And I was at a Saturday morning meeting. It was a brand new Steps and Traditions meeting, and it's my home group now. And after the meeting, there's a group of folks go out for coffee. And a group of us was sitting at coffee one morning, and this fella sitting across the table from me kept looking at me. And finally he said, didn't you used to drink at Mr. Flood's party time in Ann Arbor, Michigan? And the second thought I had was, I wonder if I owe this guy amends. And some of you who laughed know what the first thought was. You drank in bars too. And he introduced me to his sponsor. I'm not sure that he meant for me to marry his sponsor because he was trying to fix his sponsor up with someone else at the time. My husband and I were married in January of 1989, and my husband has 32 years of sobriety. And our life is just absolutely incredible. Before we got married, my husband and I were having a conversation about our priorities, and he said to me, you know, the most important thing in my life is Alcoholics Anonymous. And I started to get upset about that because he loves me. I'm supposed to be the most important thing in his life. And then I talked to my sponsor about it, and she suggested to me that probably Alcoholics Anonymous is more important to me than he is. And then I could see how AA could be more important to him. We work the traditions in our home. I'm always amused when I hear someone say that the traditions are to the group what the steps are to the individual, because it's been my experience that that we're a group, and the traditions are to our group at home what the steps are to each of us. We practice the 7th tradition in our home, and then that doesn't mean that we both bring in a paycheck, although both of us do. It does mean that both of us contribute around our home. And we have trusted servants in our home. No one governs. I forget that sometimes. And he reminds me. Sometimes lovingly, sometimes not. Not judging, just reporting. I do want to say incredible things have happened in our life. I lost my job a couple years ago and found a new one, and the company I'm with now is now going through, they're calling it a re-engineering. The other company that I was with where I lost my job, they were right-sizing. I was the wrong size. I'm not sure, we're re-engineering and I'm not an engineer, I guess. And I'm not sure what's going to happen. We find out at the end of May, those of us who get to keep jobs and those of us who are losing them. And then we get to live with that until... And I've been under incredible stress and not even realizing it until this past week. But I want to say several things. First of all, a couple years ago, my husband's oldest son, when we married, I married into 5 children and 11 grandchildren. And I love our kids. I have no children of my own, and I love being a grandma. I have a wonderful wife-in-law. The mother of my children is an incredible woman. She raised these 5 kids as a single mom, and she did a great job at it. These kids are terrific. And the boys call me their stepmom, and the girls just call me Penny. A couple of years ago, our oldest son came out to visit to go to a 49ers game with his dad. And a couple of weeks later, we got a call that he had gone into treatment. And our oldest son is 2 years sober in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, and our youngest son is out there being a duck. I talked to John about coming into AA, and he said, I never knew anything about Alcoholics Anonymous before I met Dad's friends. And I didn't get it because his dad was 30 years sober at the time. And I think it, for us, it was an example of how it's hard to hear this from family. We can hear this from other people. In 1987, I had the opportunity to go back and visit my family for a few days, and I specifically went back because a niece of mine was doing binge drinking. And I'd love to stand here and tell you that I did it, that I went back to talk to her about AA for all the right reasons. But I'm selfish and self-centered and self-seeking, and I went back to talk to Suzanne about Alcoholics Anonymous so that when she died, not if she died, I knew she was going to die. When she died, I would not be able to say that, I shoulda, I coulda, I woulda. And later that summer, I got a collect phone call from the Framingham State Penitentiary for Women, and it was from my niece. And she was a guest of the state of Massachusetts and had an option, which isn't often given, that they had a new experimental program that she could either quit drinking and quit using and go into a treatment program, or she would have to do a year mandatory in the penitentiary. And she asked me what she should do. She wasn't sure she could quit drinking and quit using. And I realized at that time that if somebody had offered me on October 8th, 1977, the opportunity to get sober, I couldn't have taken it. That I had to drink everything I did and do everything I did to be able to walk in here the next day. And Suzanne has 7 years of sobriety. She was out here to visit us last summer with her 2 little girls who have never seen their mom drunk. And it's an incredible life. Since January of this year, in January, a fellow that I got sober with, he walked in the doors 5 days before me. He was 13 years old when he got here. And in January, he spoke at the Young People's Conference up in Pleasanton, and Drew has 18 years of sobriety. And I had the opportunity to spend some time with him. A couple weeks later, I got a phone call from a fellow that my husband sponsors, and he had run into a woman in San Francisco who had talked about being in Hawaii, and he asked her if she knew me. And it was Connie C., who was at my first meeting. And she lives in San Francisco now, and Connie and I have reconnected. In February, I was speaking at the Women's Penitentiary in Dublin, and after I spoke, there were 9 inmates in the room, and after I spoke, a woman came up to me and she said, "You probably don't remember me, do you?" And I said, "No, I don't think I do." She said, "You were at one of my first meetings." And Karen didn't stay sober, but she's sober now in the penitentiary. She has 5 more years on her sentence. I spoke in Santa Clara last month, and there was a fellow there that chairman of the meeting was at one of my early meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous, and Bud gives everybody a marble when they're new, so that if you pick up a drink after you've been here and you know what we know about alcoholism, you can throw away the marble, because if you take a drink now, you've lost your marbles. And I still have my marble that Bud gave me 18 years ago, but he gave me another one just in case. And as Bud and I were talking, he said, "Do you remember Don H.?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Well, he lives around here now. He usually comes to this meeting, but I guess he's not going to make it tonight." And the way they do the meeting there is they have birthdays, and then they have a break, and then they have the speaker. And during the break, Bud sent one of his pigeons out to call Don, and Don came over to hear me speak. And Don was at my first meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, and he chaired my second meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I hated Don, because Don was honest with me. And you know, if you're still sober in the same place where you got sober, these things that I've just shared with you may not seem unusual. But I got sober 18 years ago, 2,000 miles from here. And since that time, I've lived in other parts of the country, and I've traveled all over. And I've lost total touch with people that knew me when I first got sober. And since January of this year, I've had the opportunity to get in touch with 5 more people. And in June, Glenn and I are going down to Powwow, and there are 2 more women in the program that I'm going to have the opportunity to see that are living there, that were in my... One of them is Blanche W., who was the coffee maker in my first meeting. And you know, I don't know what message I carry with regard to Alcoholics Anonymous, except that I know that the woman that walked in the door is nothing like the woman who stands before you today. And that if I'd been given the choice 18 years ago of what I wanted my life to be like in May of 1996, I wouldn't be standing on this mountain, and I wouldn't be with you people. And I'd probably be in a sanitarium or a prison or dead. And I heard somebody say one time at a meeting that rather than regretting that he wasted half of his life drinking, he's just grateful that God has given him the rare opportunity to live 2 lives in one lifetime. And that's what's happened for me. I lived that other life, and today I get to live this life. And I don't know why I get to live this life. I don't know why I've been given the gifts I've been given. But without question, I know who to thank. And I know that I have to thank my higher power. And I know that I have to thank you people. Because you're the ones that reached out to me, and you're the ones that shared your experience, strength, and hope with me. When you shared your experiences with me, I saw where you got your strength. And when I saw where you got your strength, it gave me some hope. And when I got some hope, I got a little bit of faith. And when I got my faith, I found out about love. I sat in a meeting one time and heard somebody say, "Let us love you until you can learn to love yourself." And I thought, what's going to happen when you find out I'm not lovable? And today the license plate on my vehicle says, "I am loved." And it's not there because I have a wonderful husband who loves me, although I do. And it's not there because I have this wonderful family back in my life, although I do. It's there because I have a higher power who loves me today, and that I found him through you. And I can never thank you enough for that. Thank you for giving me the chance.